The autumn evening was settling in, painting the suburban Virginia sky in soft shades of orange and purple. Maya Chen adjusted her rearview mirror, humming along to her favorite R&B song as she drove home from debate team practice. The 17-year-old's mind was still buzzing with excitement from winning her argument about environmental policy. Her teammates had cheered when she delivered her closing statement, and even their tough coach had nodded in approval. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on as she turned onto Oak Ridge Avenue, the familiar route she'd driven countless times before. Her dad would probably still be at work. He always stayed late at his FBI office on Thursdays, but she'd promised to save him some of the celebration cookies her debate team had shared after their victory. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her mirror, cutting through her thoughts. Maya checked her speed. She was going exactly at the limit. Her heart started beating faster, but she remembered her father's careful instructions: stay calm, be polite, and know your rights. She signaled and pulled over smoothly, positioning her car well off the road for safety. Officer Richard Bennett watched the silver Honda ease to a stop, his fingers drumming against his steering wheel. It had been a quiet night, too quiet for his liking. He'd seen the car turn out of the high school parking lot, and something about it just didn't sit right with him. This neighborhood had been changing too much lately, and he'd made it his personal mission to maintain order. Mia already had her license, registration, and student ID ready when the officer approached. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, just like her father had taught her. The beam from Bennett's flashlight swept across her face, lingering a bit too long. "License and registration," Bennett barked, his tone already carrying an edge that made Mia's stomach tighten. She handed over her documents with a steady hand, proud that she managed to keep her voice clear and respectful. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" Bennett ignored her question, studying her license with exaggerated scrutiny. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" His voice carried a hint of accusation, even though Mia lived just 3 blocks away. "No, sir. I live on Maple Court, just around the corner. I'm coming home from debate team practice at—" "Step out of the vehicle," Bennett cut her off, his hand already moving to rest on his holster, an unnecessary gesture that sent a chill down Mia's spine. "Sir, I don't understand. Have I done something wrong?" Mia started recording on her phone, carefully sliding it into her cup holder with the camera facing out. Another lesson from her father: always document everything. "I said step out of the vehicle. I smell something suspicious." Bennett's face hardened, and he tapped his flashlight against her window with increasing aggression. Mia's heart raced, but her mind stayed sharp. She knew there couldn't be any suspicious smell. She didn't even allow her friends to vape in her car. Through the side mirror, she noticed a couple walking their dog had stopped to watch. The woman had her phone out, recording. More witnesses appeared on porches across the street, drawn by the police lights and Bennett's escalating voice. "Sir, I respectfully decline to exit my vehicle without probable cause," Maya stated firmly, her voice carrying the confidence she'd developed through years of debate competitions. "I'd like to call my father, who works for the—" "Your father?" Bennett scoffed, his face twisting into an ugly smirk. "Listen here, little girl. I don't care who your daddy is. Around here, I'm the law. Now exit the vehicle before I make you exit the vehicle." The situation was spiraling, and Mia could feel tears threatening to form in her eyes. But she blinked them back, remembering all the times her father had told her about standing up to injustice. She kept her hands visible and her voice steady, even as she noticed more phones recording from the growing crowd of neighbors. As Bennett radioed for backup, claiming a combative subject, Mia discreetly pressed her father's contact number on her phone. She knew he always kept his personal line on, even during important meetings. What she didn't know was that her father was about to turn this officer's whole world upside down. The gathering crowd of witnesses, the multiple recording phones, and most importantly, the direct line to an FBI agent father, none of these factors had registered in Officer Bennett's mind yet. He was about to learn a harsh lesson about power, prejudice, and justice in modern America. But for now, he stood there, hand on his holster, drunk on authority, completely unaware that his career was about to implode in spectacular fashion. The backup Officer Bennett called for hadn't arrived yet, but his patience had already run out. The growing crowd of onlookers only fueled his anger. their phone cameras gleaming like accusatory eyes in the darkness. He reached for Mia's car door handle, yanking it open with unnecessary force. "Last warning," he growled, his flashlight beam drilling into her eyes. "Exit the vehicle now." Mia's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, I'm a minor, and I have the right to wait for my parent or guardian before." Bennett's hand shot forward, grabbing her arm. The sudden movement sent Mia's phone tumbling from the cup holder, but it kept recording as she was roughly pulled from her car. The neighbors watching from their porches gasped, and someone shouted, "Hey, she's just a kid." Mrs. Thompson, Mia's AP history teacher who lived on the corner, pushed through the crowd. "Officer, I know this student. She's an honor roll student, and this is completely unnecessary." "Stay back," Bennett barked, positioning himself between Mia and the gathering witnesses. "This is a police matter. Clear the area." But nobody moved. Instead, more phones came out, recording everything. The elderly couple from the blue house across the street. The college students who lived in the rental next door. The mom who always waved to Mia on her morning jogs. All of them stood their ground, bearing witness. Maya winced as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, too tight, the cold metal biting into her skin. She could feel her debate team medal, still hanging around her neck, now pressed uncomfortably against her collarbone. Just an hour ago, she'd been celebrating with her teammates. Now she was being treated like a criminal, and for what? "Officer, please." Mia kept her voice controlled, though tears threatened to spill. "My father is expecting me home. He's a federal." "I told you, I don't care who your daddy is," Bennett snapped, his face flushed with anger. "You people always think you're above the law, always playing the victim card. Well, guess what? Tonight you're learning a real lesson about respect for authority." A police cruiser rounded the corner. Bennett's backup finally arriving. The second officer, a younger woman, took in the scene with visible concern. A teenage girl in handcuffs, at least a dozen witnesses recording, and her colleague's obvious agitation. "What's the situation here?" she asked, approaching cautiously. "Suspicious behavior, resisting arrest, possible contraband," Bennett rattled off, though his cruiser's searchlight illuminating the honor roll bumper sticker on Mia's car told a different story. "We're taking her in." The female officer glanced at Mia, then at the crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Did you call her parents?" "She's been non-compliant," Bennett said sharply. "We'll deal with the parents at the station." What Bennett didn't know was that Mia's call had already gone through. Her father had heard everything. The aggressive commands, the baseless accusations, the sound of his daughter being handcuffed. He was already making calls, setting things in motion that would shake the department to its core. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward again, phone still recording. "I'm noting Officer Bennett's badge number and name. This is completely unacceptable treatment of a minor." Bennett ignored her, roughly guiding Mia toward his cruiser. Maya held her head high, even as tears finally escaped down her cheeks. She remembered her father's words from long ago. Sometimes the best way to fight injustice is to let them show their true colors while you maintain your dignity. The female officer, reading the room better than her colleague, quietly slipped her personal card to Mrs. Thompson. She knew this wouldn't end well for Bennett, and she wanted no part of his power trip. As Mia was placed in the back of the police car, she caught fragments of conversation from the crowd. "I've got everything on video. This is going viral tonight. Somebody call the news. That poor girl's father is going to raise hell." They had no idea just how right they were about that last part. Inside the cruiser, Maya took slow, deep breaths, focusing on staying calm. She knew her father would be moving heaven and earth right now. She'd seen him handle cases like this before, not as a worried parent, but as a federal agent specializing in civil rights violations. Officer Bennett had no idea that his lesson about respect was about to become a masterclass in consequences. The cruiser pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a neighborhood buzzing with phones sharing videos and messages. Bennett's chest puffed with satisfaction, believing he'd successfully asserted his authority. But in reality, he'd just set in motion his own downfall. His badge, which he'd wielded like a shield for so long, was about to become a target, and the very system he thought would protect him was about to prove him very, very wrong. Agent David Chen sat in his office at the FBI Civil Rights Division, surrounded by case files and the gentle hum of his computer. The wall clock showed 8:45 p.m., and he was just wrapping up a report on police misconduct in another state. 20 years of investigating civil rights violations had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but nothing had prepared him for the call he was about to receive. His phone buzzed on the desk. Mia's contact photo lit up the screen, her bright smile from debate team nationals last year. But instead of her voice, he heard the sounds that would make any father's blood run cold. His daughter being forcibly removed from her car, an officer's aggressive commands, the click of handcuffs. David's hands clenched into fists, but his face remained composed. Years of training kicked in as he quickly activated his phone's recording function and opened his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up databases and sending rapid-fire messages to trusted colleagues. Chen, his office partner, Agent Rodriguez, stuck his head in the door. "You still here?" Unheading, he stopped mid-sentence, seeing David's expression. "What's wrong?" David held up one finger, still listening to the audio stream from Mia's phone. His other hand was already typing an email to the head of internal affairs at the local police department. "My daughter's being arrested," he said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made Rodriguez step fully into the office and shut the door. "What happened?" Rodriguez pulled up a chair, already reaching for his own phone. They'd worked together long enough to know when something big was going down. "Officer Richard Bennett," David read from his screen, his voice clipped. 3 complaints of excessive force in the past year, all mysteriously dropped, all involving minority teenagers. And now he's got my daughter in handcuffs for, quote, suspicious behavior. Rodriguez whistle-blow. "Bennett? That name's come up before. Wasn't he involved in that incident last summer?" "Pull the file," David commanded, his fingers never stopping their rapid movement across the keyboard. "I want everything we have on him. Every complaint, every incident report, every traffic stop he's made in the last 5 years. Pattern and practice investigation, full scope." Their office came alive with purposeful energy. Rodriguez made calls while David coordinated with the local FBI field office. Within minutes, a task force was forming. On David's screen, text messages poured in from neighbors he'd never met, sending video clips of the incident. Mrs. Thompson, Mia's teacher, had already emailed a detailed witness statement and her own footage. In the elevator, David took a deep breath, channeling his parental anger into professional purpose. Bennett thought he was teaching Mia a lesson about authority. Instead, he was about to learn one about accountability from a father who'd spent his career making sure officers like him couldn't hide behind their badges. The elevator doors opened to the parking garage, and David Chen stepped out, every inch the federal agent on a mission. His daughter had maintained her dignity in the face of injustice. Now it was his turn to show her how the system could work when good people stood up and did their jobs right. Officer Bennett's night was about to get much, much longer. The police station buzzed with nervous energy as David Chen walked through the front doors. News vans lined the street outside, their lights creating an artificial day in the parking lot. The desk sergeant's eyes widened as David pulled out his FBI credentials. "I'm here about the arrest of a minor that occurred approximately 1 hour ago," David said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people sit up straight. "Officer Bennett's case." The sergeant fumbled with his phone. "Sir, I'll need to contact the watch commander." "Already done," David cut him off smoothly. "In fact, your chief should be receiving a call from the Department of Justice right about now." Down the hall, Officer Bennett was filling out paperwork, still riding the high of putting another troublemaker in their place. The watch commander's voice crackled over his radio. "Bennett, report to my office. Now." As Bennett walked the familiar route to his commander's office, his confident strut faltered at the sight of suits in the hallway. FBI jackets, internal affairs. His stomach dropped as he recognized one of the agents reviewing documents. He'd seen him speak at a community oversight meeting last year. Inside the holding area, Mia sat quietly, her debate medal still hanging around her neck. The female officer who'd arrived as backup kept glancing at her uneasily, especially after the calls started coming in from higher up the chain of command. "Your father's here," she told Maya softly, unlocking the cell. "And I'm sorry about all this." Meanwhile, in the watch commander's office, Agent Rodriguez was spreading photos across the desk. 6 traffic stops in the past month, all involving minority teenagers, all with the same pattern, all with mysteriously malfunctioning body cameras. The watch commander's face grew increasingly pale as he flipped through the evidence. We didn't know." "That's the problem," David interrupted, entering the room. "You didn't want to know. But now you're going to learn everything." He placed a stack of warrants on the desk. "We're seizing all records relating to Officer Bennett's traffic stops for the past 5 years. Computer files, body cam footage, dash cam videos, personal communications on department devices." Down the hall, Bennett sat alone in an interview room, his arrogance melting into fear as he scrolled through social media on his phone. The videos were everywhere. His face, his badge number, his actions played on repeat. The comments were flooding in, many from familiar names, people in the community he'd taught lessons to before. Back in the evidence room, Agent Rodriguez and his team worked with surgical precision. "Look at this," he called to David. "Complaint filed last month. African-American honor student. Charge, suspicious behavior. Complaint mysteriously withdrawn after a meeting with the officer." David's team pulled financial records, small deposits to various accounts, convenient dismissals of tickets. A pattern emerged of intimidation and buried complaints. Bennett hadn't been working alone. He'd had help keeping his activities quiet. The police chief arrived, looking harried. "Agent Chen, this is highly unusual. Surely we can handle this internally. Like you handled the Thompson case." David pulled up a file on his tablet. "Or the Rivera incident? Or maybe like the Lynn complaint? All buried. All involving the same officer. All involving minority youth. This stopped being an internal matter the moment it became a pattern of civil rights violations." In another room, Maya was giving her statement to a female FBI agent, her voice steady as she recounted every detail. Her phone recording played in the background, Bennett's aggressive tone filling the room. The agent's face remained professional, but her pen pressed harder into the paper with each documented violation. "Your daughter handled herself remarkably well," the agent told David during a brief break. "She did everything right, maintained her composure, documented everything, knew her rights. You trained her well." David's expression softened for a moment. "I just never thought she'd have to use that training. Not here, not now." As midnight approached, the station hummed with activity. Internal affairs officers boxed up files. FBI agents conducted interviews. Officers who had turned a blind eye to Bennett's behavior suddenly found their own records under scrutiny. Bennett sat in the break room, abandoned by his usual supporters, watching his career crumble on the late news. The reporter's voice was clear. "Sources say this incident has triggered a federal investigation into a pattern of civil rights violations." In the chief's office, David stood by the window, watching more news vans arrive. "This isn't going away," he told the chief. "The only question is how deep the rot goes, and how many people helped cover it up." The chief slumped in his chair. "What do you want?" "Everything," David replied. "Every complaint that was buried. Every officer who looked the other way. Every supervisor who helped sweep things under the rug. By morning, I want to know everyone who helped turn Officer Bennett into the department's personal enforcer." As David finally led Mia out of the station, reporters called out questions, but he simply kept walking, his arm around his daughter's shoulders. The real work would begin tomorrow, dismantling the system that had protected Bennett for so long. In the car, Mia finally let her composure crack, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Dad, thank you." David squeezed her hand. "No, thank you. Your courage tonight didn't just stand up to one bad officer. It's going to help us protect a lot of other kids who didn't have someone to call." As they drove home, more photos and videos continued to surface online. Officer Bennett's long history of misconduct was being exposed, one post at a time. The thin blue line that had protected him for so long was about to learn that justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise, backed by federal law and a father's determination to make things right. The morning sun crept through the blinds of the FBI field office as David Chen reviewed the mountains of evidence his team had gathered overnight. Coffee cups littered the conference room table, surrounded by stacks of files and laptops displaying data streams. Agent Rodriguez walked in, carrying fresh coffee and a tablet filled with new information. "You're not going to believe this," Rodriguez said, sliding into a chair. "Remember those mysterious complaint withdrawals? We'd found a pattern in the department's database. Every withdrawal was processed by the same administrative clerk, always on Thursdays, always after hours." David looked up from his screen. "Let me guess. Overtime pay." "Better. The clerk's son got a job at Bennett's brother's construction company. Entry-level position, 6-figure salary." Rodriguez pulled up the financial records, and that's just the start. The investigation had grown beyond a single incident of racial profiling into something much larger. On the wall, a digital map displayed red pins marking every documented incident involving Bennett, creating a clear pattern of targeted neighborhoods and demographics. A young FBI analyst rushed in, her eyes bright with discovery. "Sir, we found something in the body cam archives. Bennett didn't just turn his camera off, someone in it was deleting footage, but they weren't very tech-savvy. We recovered fragments from the backup server." The recovered footage played on the conference room screen, Bennett's previous stops, his aggressive behavior, the fear in young faces. But more importantly, the footage showed other officers standing by, watching, doing nothing. The thin blue line wasn't just protecting Bennett, it was enabling him. In another room, Mia sat with civil rights attorneys, sharing her story. Her debate team training showed as she recalled every detail with precision. The lawyers exchanged glances. She was the perfect witness, articulate and composed, with an impeccable record and irrefutable evidence. "Your daughter's case is the key," the lead attorney told David during a break. "It's not just what happened to her, it's how many others will come forward because of her courage." She was right. Since the news broke, the office had been flooded with calls. Parents sharing similar stories, teachers who'd witnessed incidents, even former officers who'd stayed silent but couldn't anymore. Each call added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a system of intimidation and cover-ups that had persisted for years. Back at the police station, the internal affairs investigation was causing chaos. Officers who'd looked the other way suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. The police chief's secretary worked overtime, pulling files that should have been easily accessible but were mysteriously misplaced. "The chief's been in meetings all morning," Rodriguez reported, checking his phone. "First with the mayor, then the police union, now the city council. They're starting to realize this isn't going away." David nodded, studying a report. "Look at these traffic stop statistics. Bennett's suspicious behavior stops were 8 times more likely to involve minority teenagers, and the department's own data proves it." The evidence wall grew as the day progressed. Photos of Bennett with other officers at private gatherings, suggesting personal relationships that explained the lack of oversight. Spreadsheets showing suspicious patterns in overtime pay for officers who helped bury complaints. Email chains revealing coded language used to flag certain drivers for extra attention. A community organizer arrived with more stories collected from neighborhood residents. "People are finally speaking up," she told David. Your daughter's courage gave them hope that maybe this time something will actually change. In the break room, David watched the news coverage. Local stations were running special reports on police accountability. National media was picking up the story. Social media continued to explode with hashtags demanding justice. Bennett's actions had opened a door that couldn't be closed. "We've got something bigger," Rodriguez announced late in the afternoon. "Remember those construction company payments? They lead back to a foundation that's been funding police union activities, the same foundation that lobbied against body cam requirements last year." David stood at the evidence wall, connecting threads between photos and documents. This wasn't just about one officer anymore, it was about a system that protected its own at the expense of justice. But systems could be changed, especially when the evidence was undeniable. His phone buzzed, a text from Mia. "Dad, my debate team is organizing a student forum on police accountability. Half the school wants to attend. Even the principal is supporting us." He smiled, pride mixing with determination. His daughter wasn't just a victim in this story, she was becoming a catalyst for change. Her incident was transforming from a single act of injustice into a movement for accountability. As evening approached, David gathered his team for a briefing. The conference room was packed. FBI agents, civil rights attorneys, data analysts, all working together to build an airtight case. Tomorrow, he announced, we start presenting our findings. Bennett thought he was untouchable because the system protected him. Now we're going to show him and everyone else that the system is designed to serve justice, not obstruct it. On his screen, another email arrived, more witnesses coming forward, more evidence to process. The case was growing stronger by the hour, building towards something that would shake the department to its foundations. Bennett had no idea that his impulsive action against one teenager would expose years of misconduct and trigger a complete overhaul of the system he'd manipulated for so long. But that's exactly what was about to happen, one piece of evidence at a time. The police department's hearing room was packed to capacity. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of tense faces. Officer Bennett sat at the front table, his usual swagger replaced by nervous fidgeting. His union representative whispered urgently in his ear, but Bennett barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on David Chen, who stood calmly arranging documents at the prosecution table. The police chief and review board members filed in, their faces grave. News of the federal investigation had spread like wildfire, and this hearing was just the beginning. Camera crews waited outside, held back by security, but the room itself was filled with witnesses ready to testify. This disciplinary hearing is now in session, the board chairman announced, his voice echoing in the hushed room. We're here to review the conduct of Officer Richard Bennett regarding multiple incidents of alleged misconduct, specifically focusing on the recent arrest of a minor. David stood, his presence commanding attention. Before we begin, I'd like to enter into evidence several items recently discovered through our federal investigation. He nodded to Agent Rodriguez, who wheeled in a cart loaded with files and a laptop. Bennett's union rep jumped up. Objection. We haven't had time to review any new evidence. The evidence was made available to your office yesterday afternoon, David replied smoothly, as required by procedure. But if you'd like, we can recess while you review it. Though I should warn you, there's quite a lot. The room stirred as David began setting up a presentation screen. Bennett's face grew increasingly pale as he recognized photos being arranged, traffic stops he thought no one had witnessed, meetings that weren't supposed to have been documented. Let's start with the night my daughter was arrested, David began, his voice steady. But not with her story, we'll get to that. Instead, let's look at what Officer Bennett did earlier that day. The screen came to life, showing surveillance footage from a coffee shop. Bennett was there, meeting with another officer, clearly discussing something urgent. David played the audio, enhanced by FBI tech. Just make sure the cameras are off when you need them to be. It knows the drill. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his seat as David methodically laid out the evidence. Maps showing his patrol patterns, targeting specific neighborhoods. Financial records revealing unexplained deposits. Statements from other officers about unwritten policies. Officer Bennett, David turned to face him directly. Would you like to explain why your body camera malfunctioned during 13 specific traffic stops, all involving minority teenagers? The union rep whispered something, but Bennett spoke anyway, his voice defensive. Equipment fails sometimes. That's not a crime. You're right, David agreed. Equipment does fail, but usually not in such a convenient pattern. He pulled up at technical analysis. Your camera didn't fail, Officer Bennett. It was manually disabled. We have the access logs. The room buzzed with whispers. Board members leaned forward, frowning as they took notes. The police chief's face had turned an interesting shade of gray. But let's talk about my daughter, David continued, his tone shifting. An honor student heading home from debate practice. You claim to smell something suspicious. Funny how that same phrase appears in 27 of your previous reports, all involving minority youth, all mysteriously resolved without formal charges. Bennett's arrogance finally cracked. You can't prove anything. This is just a witch hunt because your kid couldn't follow simple instructions. The outburst echoed in the sudden silence. David merely raised an eyebrow and pressed a button on his laptop. The screen showed a new video, not from the recent arrest, but from 6 months ago. Another traffic stop, another teenager, the same aggressive approach. This footage was supposedly deleted, David explained. But the FBI is very good at recovery. We found dozens of these, each one showing the same pattern of behavior, each one buried by the same network of enablers. He turned to the board. This isn't just about one bad officer. This is about a system that protected him. Every person who helped hide evidence, every supervisor who looked the other way, they're all part of this. The next hour was devastating. Witness after witness came forward. Teachers, parents, even rookie officers who'd been told to learn from Bennett's example. Each testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence crushing Bennett's career. Mrs. Thompson, Mia's teacher, described not just the recent incident, but years of hearing similar stories from other students. A former dispatch operator detailed how certain calls were routed specifically to Bennett. An 8 technician admitted to being pressured to lose specific body cam footage. Bennett slumped further in his chair as his carefully constructed world crumbled. The union rep had stopped whispering advice and was now frantically taking notes, probably planning his own defense. Finally, David played the full audio from Mia's phone, enhanced to crystal clarity. Bennett's voice filled the room, dripping with prejudice and abuse of power. Board members winced at his language, at the sound of handcuffs being applied too tightly, at the clear violation of department policies and basic human dignity. Officer Bennett thought he was teaching my daughter a lesson that night, David concluded, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. And he did. He taught her that justice doesn't come from a badge, it comes from people willing to stand up and say enough. The board chairman cleared his throat. Officer Bennett, do you have anything to say in your defense? Bennett looked around the room, seeking allies, finding none. The other officers who'd once supported him were conspicuously absent. His network of protection had evaporated in the face of overwhelming evidence. I was just doing my job, he mumbled, but the words sounded hollow even to him. No, David corrected him. You were abusing your job. And now you're going to face the consequences, not just here, but in federal court. As the board prepared to deliberate, Bennett finally realized the full scope of what he'd unleashed. One traffic stop, one act of prejudice too many, and his whole world had unraveled. He'd thought the system would protect him, as it always had before. He'd been wrong. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the police department's community meeting room looked very different. Gone were the stern-faced officers and tension-filled silence. Instead, the room buzzed with energy as teenagers, community leaders, and police officers gathered for the first meeting of the Youth Police Advisory Council. Maya stood at the podium, her debate medal catching the light as she addressed the crowd. 6 months ago, I was wrongfully arrested right around the corner from here. Today, I'm standing in this room not as a victim, but as the chair of a council that will help make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. In the audience, David Chen sat with Agent Rodriguez, watching his daughter with pride. The changes they'd fought for were finally becoming reality. Officer Bennett's case had triggered a cascade of reforms that were transforming the department. As most of you know, Mia continued, Officer Bennett was not only fired but faced federal charges. But this isn't about one officer anymore. This is about creating lasting change. The screen behind her displayed the changes already implemented. Mandatory body camera checks before each shift, with footage automatically uploaded to an independent server. New oversight committees with real power to investigate complaints. Required monthly meetings between officers and community members. A complete overhaul of the department's traffic stop procedures. The new police chief, a reform-minded veteran who'd been brought in to clean house, stood up to speak next. When this story broke, it would have been easy to just fire one officer and claim we'd solved the problem. Instead, we chose to look deeper, to acknowledge our failures, and to rebuild trust with our community. The changes weren't just on paper. The audience included several officers who'd come forward after Bennett's case, breaking the code of silence to report other instances of misconduct. They'd faced criticism from some colleagues, but support from the community had shown them they'd made the right choice. Mrs. Thompson, now serving on the Civilian Oversight Board, shared updates on the mentorship program pairing officers with high school students. We're not just building bridges, she explained. We're creating understanding that will last for generations. The 8 technician who'd helped expose the body camera tampering had been promoted to head a new transparency division, ensuring technology served accountability rather than concealing misconduct. He demonstrated the new system that made camera footage accessible for review while protecting privacy rights. David's phone buzzed with a news alert. Bennett's final appeal had been denied. The former officer would serve time for civil rights violations, sending a clear message that badges couldn't be used as shields for prejudice. But the real victory wasn't in punishment. It was in the changes happening in this room. A young officer raised her hand to share how the new training programs had helped her better understand the communities she served. A teenager described feeling safer during traffic stops, knowing there were real accountability measures in place. The hardest part, Mia admitted to the group, was believing that speaking up would matter, that anyone would listen. But what I learned is that change is possible when people refuse to look away. The proof was in the statistics projected on the screen: complaints down by 60%, community satisfaction up by 40%, and most importantly, a dramatic drop in discriminatory stops. The department had become a national model for reform, with other cities sending observers to learn from their example. After the meeting, David found Mia surrounded by other students planning their next initiative. A series of workshops helping teenagers understand their rights while teaching officers to see youth as partners in community safety. "You know," he told her quietly, "when I was building the case against Bennett, I thought success would mean winning in court. But this, what you've helped create here, this is real justice." Mia smiled, watching officers and teenagers chatting over refreshments, barriers breaking down through simple conversation. "Remember what you always told me? Justice isn't just about punishing wrong, it's about making things right." Outside, the evening sun lit up the department's new motto, installed just last week: protect, serve, and listen. It wasn't just words on a wall anymore. It was a promise being kept, one interaction at a time. The local news crew packing up their equipment had a different story to tell now, not about scandal and corruption, but about transformation and hope. Their camera caught officers and teenagers leaving together, laughing, and talking about next month's community basketball tournament. In his car, David looked at the framed photo he kept on his dash: Mia at the debate podium, now next to a newspaper clipping about the Youth Police Advisory Council. One traffic stop had exposed decades of problems, but it had also sparked something powerful: proof that the system could change when enough people demanded better. As the parking lot emptied, a new shift of officers arrived for duty, each one checking their body cameras, each one knowing they served a community that was watching, but also one that was willing to work with them to build something better. The story that began with handcuffs and fear had transformed into one of hope and change. Bennett's attempt to teach a lesson had backfired spectacularly, teaching instead that justice, while sometimes slow, was still possible. More importantly, it showed that real change doesn't just come from removing bad actors, it comes from communities brave enough to demand better and leaders willing to listen.